All right, today we're going deep. We're going to look past the static images of bone and dive right into the dynamic world of its biochemical markers.
You know, for decades, our main tool for looking at bone health has been bone density. But that's a static measurement, right? It's kind of like judging a city's economy by just one single photograph of its skyline. That picture doesn't tell you anything about the construction booms or the demolition projects that are happening every single day. So the real question becomes, how do we measure that constant dynamic activity right down at the molecular level?
And the answer lies in bone turnover markers, or BTMs. These are basically the molecules that get released into our blood or urine during that continuous process of bone remodeling. What's amazing is that they give us a real-time dynamic snapshot of what's happening in the skeleton, often showing changes way before they would ever show up on a density scan.
To really get a handle on these markers, you've got to think of bone metabolism as two sides of the exact same coin. On one side, you have formation. That's the building of new bone by cells we call osteoblasts. And on the other side, you have resorption, the breaking down of old bone by osteoclasts. So our whole review today is going to be structured around this fundamental split.
So, let's start with the first side of our coin, the markers of bone formation. These tell us all about the work of the architects, the osteoblasts, and just how fast new bone is actually being constructed.
We'll kick things off with a real classic, an enzyme a lot of you are probably familiar with, alkaline phosphatase, or ALP. Specifically, we're talking about the version, the isoenzyme that comes from bone.
Okay, so here's the key thing to get about ALP. Its actual function, its day job, is what makes it so useful clinically. It's not just hanging around while bone is being formed. It's an active player. It takes this thing called pyrophosphate, which is a major inhibitor of mineralization, and it converts it into useful inorganic phosphate. In other words, it clears the runway for calcium to be deposited. So when we see elevated levels of ALP, it's a direct signal of high osteoblast activity and increased turnover, which is exactly what you'd see in conditions like Paget's disease or when a fracture is healing.
Next up is osteocalcin. This is a protein that's a super sensitive and specific marker for what our osteoblasts are actually doing.
Now, the real value of osteocalcin is that it can tell us a story in both directions. Its job is to grab calcium ions and help weave them into the bone matrix. So naturally, elevated levels mean increased bone formation, something we see in states of high turnover like hyperparathyroidism. But, and this is just as important, depressed levels are equally informative. They signal a slowdown in osteoblast activity, which is a classic side effect of glucocorticoid treatment. That makes it a really critical marker to watch in that situation.
Now, let's get even more specific. Let's look at the direct byproducts of building the bone's fundamental framework. We're talking about the pro-collagen peptides.
This is such a great example of measuring the construction process itself. Type I collagen is the main protein that makes up the flexible scaffolding of our bones. As osteoblasts are busy making it, they have to clip off these little end pieces, the PINP and PINCP peptides. So by measuring these peptides in the blood, we're basically quantifying the rate of new collagen synthesis. It's incredibly direct. This specificity is why PINP in particular is the gold standard marker for tracking how well anabolic bone-building therapies are working. Okay, time to flip the coin. Let's talk about the demolition crew. We're going to look at the markers that tell us about the rate of bone breakdown, or resorption, which is all driven by the osteoclasts.
Let's start with another classic, a urinary marker that is a direct piece of rubble from that same collagen framework we were just talking about.
So, hydroxyproline, an amino acid that's packed into collagen. When osteoclasts get to work breaking down the bone matrix, these peptides get released, and eventually they're excreted in the urine. So a high level is a very clear sign of increased resorption, a process we know speeds up after menopause. But what's maybe even more important is that a decrease in hydroxyproline is a key indicator that our anti-resorptive drugs, like bisphosphonates, are actually working. Following that same kind of logic as hydroxyproline, hydroxylysine glycosides give us another specific window into the byproducts of all that collagen breakdown. Yeah, these glycosides are also derived from the breakdown of type 1 collagen. And while they tell a pretty similar story to hydroxyproline, they've turned out to be especially valuable for assessing the rate of bone resorption in diseases where you have excessive bone loss, with osteoporosis being the big one.
Okay, so we've been measuring the debris from the demolition. Now let's shift gears and start measuring the demolition tools themselves. We'll start with something called tartrate-resistant acid phosphatase, or TRAP5B. This is an enzyme that's released directly by the osteoclasts.
What's so important about TRAP5B is that we're not just inferring activity from the byproducts anymore. We're measuring a key piece of the actual machinery. Osteoclasts create this little bubble of highly acidic space to dissolve bone mineral, and TRAP5B is the enzyme that loves that environment and gets to work digesting the matrix. So its levels in the blood give us a direct window into how many osteoclasts are on the job and how active they are.
And that brings us to the final marker, the primary protein digesting enzyme, really the workhorse of the osteoclast, cathepsin K.
This one just perfectly captures that final, critical step of resorption. See, after the bone mineral gets dissolved, something has to digest that tough type 1 collagen framework that's left behind. And that is the job of cathepsin K. It is the powerful enzymatic engine that osteoclasts use to clear out that organic matrix. So its activity is a definitive, direct marker of ongoing, active bone breakdown.
Okay, so we've looked at the builders and we've looked at the demolishers, each in their own world. Now let's bring the two sides of that coin together and see how they create a complete, synthesized clinical story. And this slide just sums it all up perfectly. It's our whole theme right here. On one side, we measure pro-collagen peptides, which tells us about the synthesis, the creation of new type 1 collagen. On the other side, we measure hydroxyproline, which tells us about the degradation, the breakdown of that very same type 1 collagen. We're literally looking at markers from the beginning and the end of the same molecule's life cycle. It gives us this powerful, complete picture of the entire bone turnover process.
Which really just leaves us with this final thought to chew on. As our ability to measure these markers gets more and more precise, more accessible, you have to ask, is assessing a patient's bone turnover state with a simple blood or urine test going to become as routine, as fundamental a vital sign as measuring their blood pressure? The potential to dynamically monitor skeletal health in real time is, well, it's truly profound.